If you've ever wondered what it takes for a human to earn the loyalty of the galaxy's most feared killer, you're about to see it with your own eyes. But before we dive into this unbelievable encounter, make sure you hit that like button, drop a comment on what you would have done in this situation, and subscribe for more stories that prove humanity is a whole different breed. Because what you're about to hear is something even seasoned warriors can't explain, and it starts deep in the jungles of Velcara Prime. The air was so thick with heat and spores that every breath felt like swallowing warm fog. Towering fungal trees arched overhead, their luminous caps shedding ghost blue light across the tangled undergrowth. The alien patrol moved in single file, their matte black armor blending into the shadows. Xyrath Dominion soldiers were bred for the hunt, silent, calculating, relentless, and tonight, their prey was a dying god of the wild. Korvek, their leader, scanned the bioluminescent trail with slit-pupiled eyes. The Gravema's blood was everywhere, thick streaks smeared across roots, drips glowing faintly against the soil. His grip tightened on his tri-barrel rifle. "Stay sharp," he murmured through his rebreather. "A wounded Gravema is the most dangerous kind." The others nodded, but their tails twitched nervously. Gravemas didn't just kill, they erased. A single one could clear an entire village in minutes, leaving nothing but splintered bone and the faint reek of ammonia. And this one, by the look of the trail, was massive even by their standards. The jungle noises seemed to fold in on themselves the deeper they moved. No wing beats, no chirps, no distant predator calls. It was as if the entire forest knew the Gravema still lived, and had collectively decided to stay silent until it passed. Then a noise broke the stillness. Not a roar. Not the wet scrape of claws over stone. A voice. The patrol froze, their ears angling toward the sound. Korvek signaled for a halt and crouched low, parting the heavy fronds in front of him. The scene beyond was so wrong his first thought was that his optics had malfunctioned. In a clearing lit only by drifting motes, a lone human knelt beside the Gravema. The predator lay half-curled, its breathing slow but steady, its scales dulled and streaked with congealed blood. The man's hands moved with slow precision, stitching the creature's torn flank with a field medkit. He murmured something under his breath, not in Xyrathi, not in any Dominion tongue, but in the guttural rolling sounds of human standard. The Gravema's golden eye flickered open. It didn't lunge, didn't snarl. Instead, it shifted slightly to give the human better access to the wound. "Is this?" one of the soldiers whispered, voice cracking through the comms. "Impossible," Korvek snapped. He forced himself to breathe evenly. Gravema's were pure instinct, kill or consume anything living that came too close. There was no record of one hesitating, much less allowing itself to be touched. The human looked rough, mid-30s, hair grown out unevenly, stubble catching the dim light. His clothes were weather-worn, patched in too many places to count, but his movements were steady. He worked as if the Gravema wasn't a living arsenal of teeth and claws, as if sewing up its wounds was no different than fixing a torn boot. The patrol's optics displayed combat probability metrics. 99.7% chance of lethal attack if a sentient made contact with a Gravema. 99.7. But here that statistic hung in the air like a joke no one dared to laugh at. "Commander," hissed Vethra, second in command, "we should take the shot before it notices us." "No," Korvek said. His instincts screamed to fire, but something in the scene rooted him in place. There was no panic in the human's posture. No fear. It was as if he and the Gravema had reached some private understanding, one no amount of military logic could explain. "Humans are reckless," another soldier muttered. "Everyone knows it. They fight storms with umbrellas and think it's strategy. But this is quiet." Korvek's voice cut like a blade. He needed to think. The human tied off the last suture, then sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on his trousers. The Gravema's gaze tracked him, unblinking. For a long moment, nothing moved except the drifting spores. Then the man reached forward, laid a hand against the side of the Gravema's face, and the creature's breathing slowed even further, as if soothed by the contact. It was madness. Pure, impossible madness. Korvek signaled for the squad to retreat 2 paces, but it was too late. The Gravema's eye flicked to the treeline. The alien soldiers froze, every instinct telling them they'd been made. The predator's head lifted, nostrils flaring. Vethra tensed, ready to fire. But instead of attacking, the Gravema rose slowly to its feet, towering over the human, and stepped closer to him. The man didn't flinch. He placed a steadying hand against the predator's foreleg, and the massive creature lowered its head until its snout was nearly level with his shoulder. Korvek's breath caught. It wasn't just tolerance. It was trust. The human's eyes swept across the clearing, and locked directly onto the hidden patrol's position. He smiled. Not mockingly. Not with bravado. But with a kind of calm acknowledgement, as though he'd known they were there the entire time. The grave maw gave a low rumble, the sound vibrating through the soil under their feet, and the jungle around them seemed to breathe again, distant creatures calling out now that the moment of stillness had passed. Korvac didn't know what frightened him more, the fact that a human had tamed the most feared predator on Velkera, or the quiet certainty in that smile, a promise that whatever this was, it wasn't over. The patrol backed away, vanishing into the dark tangle of the forest, but the image burned into Korvac's mind refused to fade. Somewhere in the Dominion archives, there would be no protocol for this. No battlefield manual could explain what he had just seen. And as they retreated, the Gravemaw's golden eyes followed them through the foliage, unblinking. Cal Trenholm had learned long ago that the galaxy didn't care about sentiment. You either survived or you didn't. He'd spent years on the edge of charted space, in places where Dominion patrols came only to collect bodies and wreckage, not to save anyone. Velkera Prime was supposed to be his retirement from the chaos, a world so dangerous no one sane would come looking for him. He'd traded cities and crowded stations for the hiss of rain through fungal canopies, the ache of muscles after a long day's hunt, and the comfort of knowing that if trouble came, it would be the kind with claws instead of politics. It had been 4 days into a solo trek across the western ridge when he heard the scream. It wasn't the sharp, panicked sound of smaller prey, it was deep, guttural, echoing off the stones in a way that made his skin crawl. He knew what it was before he even reached the ridge's edge. A grave maw lay crumpled in a shallow ravine, sides heaving, its massive tail twitching weakly. A spear of blackstone jutted from its flank, and the ground around it was churned into a frenzy of broken roots and blood-slicked mud. Cal stayed low, scanning for the second grave maw that must have done this, but the air was still. Only the injured one remained. Every instinct told him to leave. Grave maws didn't distinguish between a threat and a bystander, they tore through anything within reach. But something about the way it struggled, claws scraping uselessly at the stone, froze him in place. It wasn't fear. Not entirely. It was the memory of lying in a burned-out transport shuttle years ago, half-conscious and bleeding, watching strangers walk past without stopping. He slid down the slope, boots slipping in the wet soil, keeping his rifle slung but his medkit ready. The grave maw's eye snapped open at his approach, gold irises contracting to razor-thin slits. It let out a low, rattling growl, but it didn't lunge. Not yet. Cal spoke softly, voice low and steady, knowing it couldn't understand the words. Easy now. You're in bad shape. Let me help or we both die here. The rock shard was embedded deep and removing it would hurt like hell. He planted one foot against the creature's side for leverage, gripped the slick black stone, and yanked it free in one motion. The grave maw roared, the sound like a thunderclap, and for a second he thought that was it, that the jaws would close around him and his story would end in a heartbeat. But the predator didn't strike. It collapsed forward, sides shuddering, blood pumping faster from the wound. Cal dropped to his knees beside it, slapping a coagulant patch over the gash. His hands worked on instinct, cleaning, sealing, stitching, not because he thought the grave maw would thank him, but because walking away now felt like leaving a loaded weapon to rust in the rain. The first night was the hardest. He made camp close enough to monitor its breathing but far enough that a sudden lunge wouldn't end him. Every hour, he stoked the small fire and checked the dressings, keeping one hand near his sidearm. The grave maw's eyes never fully closed, watching him through the dark like a judge deciding his fate. By the second day the bleeding had slowed. It still couldn't stand without its legs trembling, so he brought food, haunches of wild rhinoc, skinned and laid within reach. The grave maw sniffed them, then swallowed the meat whole, gaze flicking back to him with something almost like calculation. On the third night the scavengers came. 6 screeve raptors, drawn by the smell of blood, circled the camp with their sickle claws clicking against the stone. Cal had fought them before and knew they were fast enough to gut him before he could reload. He backed toward the grave maw's side, drawing his blade and rifle in a single motion. The lead raptor screeched and lunged. Cal fired once, dropping it, but the others darted in from opposite angles. Before he could pivot, a massive shadow surged past him. The grave maw slammed a forelimb down, crushing 2 raptors into the mud, then turned with a whip of its tail that sent another flying into the undergrowth. Its movements were clumsy from injury but fueled by raw force. The last raptor hesitated, then vanished into the dark. Cal stood frozen, heart hammering, the smell of blood and ozone thick in his lungs. Slowly the grave maw lowered itself back onto its haunches, chest heaving. For the first time since he'd found it, it looked directly at him without baring its teeth. From then on, the pattern changed. It let him approach without growls. It didn't flinch when he touched the sutures. Sometimes, in the quiet between rain showers, it would rest its head on the ground a few feet from where he sat, as if marking the distance as safe. By the seventh day it could stand and move without collapsing. Cal expected it to leave then, to vanish into the jungle and return to the life it had before. Instead it lingered. It followed at a distance when he went to refill his canteens, always just visible between the trees. When he made camp, it settled nearby, close enough that he could hear its slow, rumbling breaths through the night. Cal told himself it was just curiosity. A predator keeping tabs on a potential food source until it regained full strength. But when he woke one morning to find it curled in a loose semicircle around his camp, shielding him from the wind, he knew that wasn't it. This was something else. Something he didn't have words for. He began talking to it more, not expecting a response but filling the silence. He told it about the stations he'd worked on, the trade convoys he'd escorted, the battles he'd barely survived. He spoke of the years he'd spent avoiding attachments because attachments could be used against you. And he admitted, though only to the shadows and the creature's unblinking eye, that maybe he'd been wrong to think isolation was the same thing as safety. On the 10th day they reached the edge of a wide river, its surface glowing faintly with drifting spores. Cal stopped to fill his canteen, aware that the grave maw had padded up behind him without a sound. He turned, water still dripping from the container, and for the first time he saw its posture relax completely. Its tail lay still, its head lowered, not in threat, but in some alien gesture he couldn't quite name. That was when he heard the click of rifles being primed. He didn't need to look to know they were there. The alien patrol had been shadowing them for days. He'd felt their eyes on his back since the ridge. Now they stepped from the treeline, weapons leveled, their dark armor gleaming faintly in the sporelight. The grave maw growled, deep and low, and Cal felt the vibration through the soles of his boots. He didn't move toward his rifle. Didn't need to. You pull those triggers, he said, voice steady, and it charges. Nobody wins. The patrol didn't answer. They didn't lower their weapons either. The air between them tightened, the river's soft current suddenly deafening in the silence. Korvac stood at their front, his gaze shifting between Cal and the towering predator at his side. His jaw tightened as if weighing a decision that had no good outcome. Then, without a word, he motioned his soldiers back into the shadows. Cal didn't relax until the forest swallowed them completely. The grave maw didn't stop watching the treeline until long after the last footstep faded. Only then did Cal realize his hands were shaking, not from fear but from the knowledge that whatever had just happened, it had changed the rules of the game. He wasn't alone in the jungle anymore, and he didn't think he ever would be again. By the time the Dominion High Command received Korvac's report, the story had already begun to outgrow him. The footage, grainy, distant but unmistakable, showed a human standing beside a grave maw at a river's edge, hands empty, eyes steady, as the predator held its ground against armed soldiers. The recording leaked before it ever reached the secure archives. Within hours, it was spreading through military channels and public feeds alike. On the outer colonies the reaction was disbelief. In the core worlds it was fascination. Among those who had ever faced a grave maw, it was something closer to dread. Korvac sat in a steel-walled debriefing chamber, the projector casting the footage on a loop above the table. Across from him, strategist Valis leaned forward, her thin, scaled fingers tapping the surface in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "You saw this with your own eyes?" she asked without looking away from the projection. "I did." "And you didn't take the shot?" Korvac's jaw tightened. "If we had, the grave maw would have torn through half my squad before it fell. The human didn't threaten us. Valis turned her gaze on him. "He has weaponized it." "That wasn't what I saw." "It doesn't matter what you saw. Perception is reality, Commander. And right now, the perception is that a human has bonded with the most dangerous species on Velcara Prime. If he can do this once, others can follow." She killed the projection with a flick of her claw. "The High Command is already moving. Capture the human and the grave maw. Alive if possible. If not, you know the alternative." When Korvac left the chamber, the weight of her last words hung heavy on his shoulders. He'd been trained to see threats in everything. But the man in the clearing hadn't looked like a threat. He'd looked like someone who had already made his choice and would stand by it no matter the cost. Far from the Dominion's cold meeting rooms, Cal noticed the change in the jungle's rhythm. The silence that had once meant predators on the prowl now meant something else. People tracking him. He caught glimpses in the canopy at dusk, reflections from optics, the faint scent of lubricants used in Dominion weapons. The Gravemaw noticed too. Its golden eyes often shifted toward the shadows before Cal even realized anything was there. He considered changing course, but Velcara's terrain had no real safe direction. Instead, he adjusted his pace, choosing ground that made pursuit more visible. If they wanted him, they'd have to show themselves. On the 12th day after the river, they did. The same squad stepped into his path at a narrow stone bridge, rifles raised. Korvek was at the front, armor glinting in the filtered sunlight. His voice was low but carried clearly. "You need to come with us." "Not happening. This isn't a request. The Dominion sees you as a potential weapon. They won't let this stand." Cal shifted his stance slightly, one hand resting against the Gravemaw's shoulder. "It's not a weapon. It's alive. It chose to be here. You kill it and you'll prove every reason it doesn't trust your kind." Something flickered in Korvek's expression, frustration or maybe understanding. But he didn't lower his weapon. "If you think they won't kill you to get to it, you're wrong." The Gravemaw's growl rumbled low, like distant thunder rolling up through the bridge's stones. The soldiers flinched, fingers tightening on their triggers. Cal didn't raise his voice, but the edge in it was sharp enough to cut. "Then you'd better make sure you don't miss." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Korvek gave a curt signal, and the squad melted back into the forest. The Gravemaw stepped forward to stand beside Cal, gaze fixed on the retreating shapes until they were gone. By the next morning, the galaxy had caught up with them. News feeds were plastered with stills from the bridge encounter, taken from multiple angles. Some were official leaks from Dominion sources. Others came from civilian drones that had been following the patrol in secret. Commentators argued over what it meant. Diplomats issued vague statements about monitoring the situation. The term Gravemaw's man appeared on dozens of networks overnight, half whispered with awe, half spoken like a curse. But the attention came with consequences. Cal began finding signs of Gravemaw carcasses in the days that followed, burned remains, sometimes only identifiable by the unique curvature of the skull. The Dominion wasn't just after his companion, they were hunting the species. Extinction by preemption. One evening, as rain hissed against the broad fungal leaves overhead, Cal sat by the fire sharpening his knife. The Gravemaw lay nearby, its flank rising and falling in the steady rhythm of rest. He spoke quietly, knowing it didn't understand the words but suspecting it understood the intent. "They'll come for you. For us. And I'm not letting them take either." The Gravemaw's eye cracked open, catching the firelight, and for a moment Cal thought he saw something there beyond instinct, something like agreement. Korvek, meanwhile, faced pressure from above. High Command's orders were clear, but the more he reviewed the footage and the reports, the less he believed this was a case of manipulation. Still, disobeying meant more than losing his command, it meant losing his life. When the strike order finally came, it was without ceremony. Neutralize target, retrieve body if possible, destroy the Gravemaw. Korvek's squad would lead the assault at dawn. On the night before the operation, Korvek stood alone at the edge of the encampment, watching the mist coil through the treetops. He'd seen plenty of strange things in his career. Mercenaries who fought like they had nothing left to lose, smugglers who swore loyalty to crews that would abandon them in a second. But nothing like this human and his predator. It wasn't control. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something that didn't fit into Dominion doctrines of dominance or submission. Still, when the signal came at first light, he moved with the others. Orders were orders. The Gravemaw heard them before Cal did. Its head snapped up, muscles tensing, and a guttural warning rolled from its throat. Cal didn't ask questions. He grabbed his rifle, kicked dirt over the fire, and scanned the fog-thick air. Shadows moved in the mist, disciplined and deliberate. The first shot came from the left flank, sparking off a tree trunk inches from his head. The Gravemaw roared, the sound shattering the morning silence, and the forest erupted into chaos. The soldiers pressed in, forcing Cal and the Gravemaw toward higher ground. Cal moved with the terrain in mind, keeping dense growth between them and the advancing line, but every step forward meant another volley of gunfire snapping through the underbrush. By the time they reached the ridge, they were cornered. Below lay the Dominion forces, above only a narrow cliff edge and open sky. The Gravemaw stood at his side, its scales scraped and bleeding, breath heaving in clouds of vapor. Korvek stepped forward from the line, rifle in hand. His voice was steady, but there was a crack in it now. "Last chance, human." Cal glanced at the Gravemaw, then back at him. "You've had your chance. You walked away once. Do it again." Korvek didn't move. The soldiers tightened formation. And then Cal made his choice. The cliffside wind howled, carrying the tang of wet stone and blood. Cal's boots scraped against the narrow ridge, the drop yawning behind him. The grave maw stood at his side, its golden eyes locked on the advancing soldiers, lips peeled back to show rows of teeth meant to crush bone like dry twigs. Korvek's rifle stayed steady, but his gaze flicked between man and predator as if searching for some hidden advantage. Cal's voice cut through the roar of the wind. If you're going to do it, do it. But don't fool yourself into thinking you'll walk away clean. A silent signal passed down the line. 2 soldiers moved to flank. The grave maw tracked them instantly, tail curling upward like a whip poised to strike. Then the first volley came. Cal dropped low as the grave maw lunged, intercepting the shots with its massive body. The impact staggered it, but it didn't falter, tearing into the forward ranks with a ferocity that shattered the soldiers' formation. Cal fired in the gaps, picking off those trying to circle around. The air was chaos, shouts, the hiss of energy bolts, the deep, thunderous roar of the predator beside him. One of the bolts slammed into the grave maw's shoulder, searing flesh. It faltered for the briefest second, and in that instant 3 more shots hit home. Cal's gut clenched. They were trying to bring it down first, knowing that without it, he was just one man against an army. He scanned the ridge, mind racing. A jagged overhang loomed above them, weakened by erosion. If it went down, it could block the ridge entirely. It would also take a chunk of the cliff with it, and them if they weren't fast enough. Hold, he muttered to the grave maw, not sure if it understood the word but hoping it caught the intent. Then he sprinted toward the overhang, slamming the butt of his rifle into the fracture lines. Chunks of stone gave way, but it wasn't enough. He swapped to his sidearm and fired into the rock until the cracks spidered wide. The grave maw, as if sensing his plan, shifted to cover him. When a soldier broke through the smoke, it struck with a single swipe that sent the attacker tumbling off the cliff into the mist below. With a final strike of his rifle, the overhang groaned and collapsed. The rockslide roared down the slope, engulfing the forward lines in a choking cloud of dust and debris. Cal grabbed the grave maw's foreleg and pulled hard. They ran along the narrowing ridge, stones skittering into the abyss at their heels. Behind them, the Dominion's advance stalled. Korvek's voice barked orders, but the path was gone, replaced by a wall of shattered stone. Cal didn't stop until the ridge widened into a stretch of dense foliage. The grave maw collapsed to one knee, blood dark against its scales. Cal knelt beside it, hands working fast to seal the worst of the wounds with his dwindling supply of med patches. His fingers shook, but his voice stayed level. Not letting you die here. Not after all this. The grave maw's breathing slowed, but its gaze stayed locked on his face, unblinking. He wasn't sure what passed between them in that moment, gratitude, recognition, or something stranger, but it anchored him in a way no battlefield ever had. The sound of movement pulled his attention back to the ridge. Through the drifting dust, Korvek emerged alone. His rifle was lowered, though his other hand rested on the hilt of a combat blade. He stopped a dozen paces away, eyes narrowing at the sight of man and predator side by side. "You should be dead," Korvek said quietly. "Not today. You've made enemies far beyond my command. High command will send more. They won't stop until one of you is gone." Cal straightened, the grave maw rising slowly to its feet beside him despite its wounds. "Then they'll have to keep coming. We're not giving them the satisfaction." Korvek's gaze lingered as if memorizing the sight. Then, without another word, he turned and vanished back into the fog. The jungle reclaimed its sound slowly. Distant calls returned. The wind softened. Cal exhaled, tension bleeding from his shoulders. He looked at the grave maw, its great frame towering despite the injuries, and allowed himself a rare smile. "Guess we're still in this." They traveled for days after that, avoiding known paths, moving deeper into territories untouched by Dominion patrols. The grave maw's strength returned in measured increments, and Cal found himself relying on its senses as much as it relied on his. In the quiet of the evenings, they rested together, 2 survivors bound not by instinct or necessity, but by something no one else would understand. Weeks later, whispers began in the frontier stations. Hunters claimed to have seen a man walking through the mists of Velcara beside a golden-eyed monster. Some said he commanded it. Others swore the creature commanded him. The truth didn't matter. The story was already becoming legend. And in the depths of the jungle, where no Dominion drone dared fly, Cal Trenholm and the grave maw moved unseen, 2 predators in perfect accord, waiting for the day the galaxy came knocking again. When it did, they would be ready. The rain began as a whisper on the canopy, then swelled into a relentless drumbeat that blurred the lines between sky and earth. Cal moved through the sodden undergrowth, the grave maw at his flank, its scales slick and dark in the gloom. Every step was calculated, every sound weighed. They had been hunted before, but this time the air felt different, charged, heavy, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. They weren't running from Dominion foot soldiers anymore. The intel from the last settlement had been clear. High Command had sent a Tactics Warmind after them. Not a battalion, not a fleet, one single entity built to end them. A predator in every sense but human, one that wouldn't tire, hesitate, or question orders. Cal adjusted his grip on the rifle. He had faced killers before, but this was something else. Somewhere behind them, the Gravemaw's nostrils flared. Its head tilted, ears twitching toward the east. Cal followed the motion, catching only the faintest shift in the shadows between the trees. They moved again, faster this time. The jungle gave way to a jagged ravine, water raging through it from the storm's deluge. A fallen trunk bridged the gap, slick with moss and rain. Cal went first, one step at a time, feeling each shift of weight beneath his boots. The Gravemaw followed, its claws finding purchase in the wet bark. Halfway across, the world went silent. No rain, no wind, just an emptiness that sank into his bones. The Warmind emerged from the treeline without a sound. It was humanoid in shape, but its armor flowed like liquid metal over its frame, adapting to the environment as it moved. Its visor glowed faintly, an unblinking crimson eye. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. Cal's voice was low. "Go," he told the Gravemaw. "Get across. Now." The Gravemaw growled but obeyed, crossing to the far side as the Warmind stepped onto the log. Cal held his ground in the center, rain streaming down his face, rifle steady. He fired first. The shot struck the Warmind's chest, but the armor rippled, absorbing the impact with barely a shudder. The thing kept coming. Cal switched to armor-piercing rounds, aiming for the joints. This time the Warmind paused, not from pain but from recalculating. It lunged. Cal barely dodged the first strike, the log shifting beneath them. The Warmind's blade, a curve of shimmering energy, hissed inches from his throat. He countered with a burst to the torso, driving it back just enough to keep his balance. But the thing was relentless, every movement precise, economical, inevitable. Then the Gravemaw roared. It leapt onto the log from behind Cal, the force making the whole bridge quiver. The predator hit the Warmind full-on, claws scraping across its armor, teeth snapping for the exposed neck joint. The Warmind staggered but didn't fall. Its blade slashed deep into the Gravemaw's flank, spilling blood into the rain. Cal's chest clenched. He slammed the butt of his rifle into the Warmind's visor, the blow cracking the crimson lens. Sparks flared, and for the first time the machine faltered. The Gravemaw seized the opening, biting down on its weapon arm with a crunch of composite plating. They were losing the log. Cal felt it sag beneath their combined weight, the current below roaring hungrily. He made the call. "Drop it," he shouted. The Gravemaw obeyed, hurling the Warmind sideways. The momentum tore through the weakened wood. The log split with a deafening crack, and all three of them plunged into the torrent below. Cold water swallowed him instantly, the force tumbling him end over end. He fought for the surface, breaking through just in time to see the Warmind crash against a jagged rock. Sparks and shards flew, but it clawed for the riverbank, refusing to sink. The Gravemaw surfaced beside Cal, blood trailing in the current. Cal grabbed one of its dorsal ridges and let the current drag them downstream, away from the Warmind's reach. They slammed into a calmer bend of the river, pulling themselves onto the muddy shore. They didn't have long. The Warmind would recover. It wouldn't stop. Cal's mind raced, eyes scanning the bank until they landed on the jagged basalt cliffs nearby. At their base, steam vented from cracks in the rock, thermal fissures, unstable and dangerously hot. The stormwater would have flooded some, but the deeper vents would still be a death trap for anything caught inside. He looked at the Gravemaw, then toward the direction the Warmind would come from. "One shot at this," he muttered. They took position near the fissures. Cal crouched low with his rifle, the Gravemaw lying as if too injured to fight. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The rain softened, but the mist from the vents shrouded everything in shifting veils. Then the Warmind emerged from the haze, armor scorched, movements sharper, faster, adapting. It saw the Gravemaw and moved in, blade rising. Cal fired, not at the Warmind but at the ground beneath it. The shot cracked through the fissure's edge, destabilizing the rock. The Warmind stepped forward just as the basalt gave way. Its foot plunged into the vent, steam and boiling water engulfing its leg. The armor hissed violently, system screaming in protest. The Gravemaw surged up, clamping its jaws onto the Warmind's other leg, dragging it deeper into the vent. Cal poured round after round into its visor until the crimson light flickered and died. The machine thrashed once, twice, then went still as the fisher swallowed it entirely. Silence returned. Cal dropped to his knees, chest heaving. The grave moss slumped beside him, its wound still bleeding but eyes clear. He rested a hand on its neck, feeling the steady, stubborn pulse beneath the scales. Still breathing. That's enough. They sat there in the steam and fading rain, two survivors once more, the Warman's remains buried in the Earth's burning heart. Far away the Dominion would know it had failed. And Cal knew they would send something worse next time. But for now, the jungle was theirs again, and neither man nor machine would take it easily. Night fell with a weight that seemed to press the jungle flat. The storm had passed, but the air was thick and hot, each breath tasting faintly of sulfur from the fissures. Cal sat beside a low fire, its light swallowed quickly by the dark, while the grave maw lay curled just beyond the ring of heat. He had cleaned the wound as best he could, bandaged it with strips from his own shirt, but the bleeding hadn't stopped completely. Each slow exhale from the creature carried a deep rumble, a sound halfway between exhaustion and defiance. Cal was no healer, not in the way the Dominion medics were bred and programmed for it. But he had learned in the back alleys of human colonies how to keep a friend alive with less than nothing. Now, kneeling in the dirt, he worked needle and thread into the grave moss flesh, speaking low so his voice wouldn't carry. "You're not dying here," he said. "Not in their jungle." Somewhere beyond the tree line, branches cracked. The sound was too deliberate for the wind. Cal's hand went to his rifle. The grave maw's eyes opened, pupils narrowing, head turning toward the disturbance. Then the night split with a light so cold it seemed to bleach the world around it. A Dominion scout drone hovered between the trees, its sleek black body reflecting the firelight in hard glints. Its scanning beams swept across the camp, pausing as it locked onto Cal. He fired instantly. The shot shattered the drone's optics, but not before it pulsed a bright burst into the sky, a signal beacon. Cal swore under his breath. "They know where we are." The grave maw was on its feet, limping but ready. Cal kicked dirt over the fire and slung his pack over one shoulder. They moved, fast, deeper into the jungle's black veins, avoiding trails, weaving through tangled undergrowth until the humid air burned their lungs. But there was no outrunning the Dominion this time. The first sign was the low vibration in the ground, a steady mechanical rhythm that made the leaves tremble. Then came the lights, thin beams cutting through the mist, searching, converging. Cal recognized the formation, hunter-kill teams moving in a tightening circle. They reached the ruins before the noose closed. Moss-choked stone towers jutted from the ground, remnants of some pre-Dominion civilization. Arches rose half-broken over collapsed courtyards, and here and there, statues of unknown creatures stared blankly into the dark. The grave moss slowed, sniffing the air, its claws clicking softly on the wet stone. Cal's mind worked fast. The ruins could work for them if he could control the field, force the Dominion into close quarters where their tech advantage meant less. He guided the grave maw through a narrow breach into what had once been a grand hall, its ceiling mostly gone but walls intact enough to funnel anyone coming in. They didn't have to wait long. The first hunter arrived silently, dropping from the shattered wall like a shadow given form. It carried a shock rifle, but the grave maw was faster, lunging before the barrel could line up. Teeth closed over the hunter's arm, twisting until the rifle clattered to the stone. Cal grabbed it mid-fall and fired point blank, dropping the Dominion soldier in a spray of sparks. More came. Two from the main entrance, another scaling the wall like an insect. Cal ducked behind a column, firing bursts to keep them from flanking. The grave maw fought like a thing possessed, blood still seeping from its wound but each movement vicious, precise. They were winning ground until a shape entered the hall that made Cal's stomach knot. It was no war mind, this was leaner, faster, and unmistakably alive. A Dominion gene-cast warrior, engineered from birth to be a predator among predators. Its pale, elongated face bore no expression, its black eyes reflecting nothing. It carried twin blades, their edges humming faintly, and its stance was the easy confidence of a killer who'd never lost. The grave moss snarled. The warrior didn't even look at it, its gaze fixed on Cal. They moved at the same time. Cal fired, but the warrior was already spinning aside, the shot cracking into the wall. The grave maw lunged, but one blade flicked up, scoring a shallow line across its snout. The warrior flowed past, closing the distance to Cal in seconds. He barely blocked the first strike with the stolen rifle, the energy blade slicing clean through the weapon's barrel. Cal dropped the useless scrap and rolled, pulling the sidearm from his thigh holster and firing twice. One round grazed the warrior's shoulder, the other missed entirely as it twisted with unnatural speed. The grave maw hit it from behind, teeth sinking into its leg, and for the first time the warrior made a sound, a hiss, sharp and cold. It spun, driving one blade into the grave maw's side, but not deep enough to kill. Cal seized the opening, diving forward to slam into the warrior's midsection, driving them both into the base of a broken statue. The impact sent stone shrapnel flying, one chunk catching the warrior's face and splitting the skin above its eye. Cal saw the first flicker of something like fury there, and he pressed it, swinging the sidearm in a brutal arc that smashed into the wound. The warrior staggered. The grave maw lunged again, this time knocking it fully off balance. Cal's hand found the hilt of one of its own blades, wrenching it free from the warrior's grip. The sound of approaching boots echoed through the hall, more hunters closing in. They had seconds. Cal locked eyes with the grave maw, then with the warrior still struggling on the floor. "We end this now." He drove the captured blade through the warrior's chest, the hum rising to a high-pitched keen before the weapon powered down. The gene cast shuddered once and went still. Cal yanked the blade free just as the first of the new hunters entered the hall. The grave maw roared, a sound that filled the ruins and sent the nearest soldier stumbling back. Cal took the moment, sprinting toward a collapsed wall and hauling himself up, the grave maw close behind despite its wounds. They dropped into the overgrown courtyard beyond and didn't stop running until the jungle swallowed them whole. Somewhere behind, the Dominion was regrouping. They had taken losses tonight, and they would come harder next time. But Cal felt something shift in the balance. The Warmind had failed. The gene cast had fallen. Word would spread, even through the Dominion's tightly controlled channels. A human and an apex predator had fought side by side and lived. In the eyes of every soldier and citizen who heard it, that would be more than a story. It would be a warning.